Speaking, yes, but it's not showing up. Oh, yeah? Okay, because it doesn't seem to show up on my screen. Okay, good enough. Okay. But first, I would like to call on my son, Joe, who is going to set the appropriate tone for this program. Joe, you're on.
Thank you, Daddy. Thank you, everyone. It's good to see everyone, or at least the 9 people that I see on my screen. It's certainly an honor and a privilege to participate in this Yom Iyun, especially from the comforts of my home. Although we certainly would have liked to have been with you, Dad, and my family certainly was looking forward to that free trip down to Florida. We'll save that, of course, for another year. There's really not much time to tell all the details of my mother's life. You're going to have to wait for the movie to see those details. And therefore, I really want to use the time that was allotted to me to just tell you just a few facts, a few details of my mother's life, and try to put it in perspective with a beautiful Sfas Emes. And then, of course, use the remaining hour of my time to explain what all of this has to do with you and me. So let me just tell you a little about my mother. My dear mother, Evelyn Kranzler, Chayalea Bas Harav Aaron, was nifteris 5 years ago, Chaf Hei Cheshvan. At the end of her life, she suffered terribly from ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. But even many years before that, she already was battling cancer, and she wasn't well, probably, if I'm not mistaken, 17, 18 years. My children really never knew my mother when she was well, but they knew enough about her, and we talk about my mother all the time. Who was she? Who was my mother? My dear mother was fiercely intelligent. She was very well read. She was articulate. She was classy. She had a passion to learn, and even more importantly, she had an incredible passion to teach, to give over, as well as a passion to shop. My mother loved to interact with people, loved to talk, loved to exchange ideas. But if anyone has ever dealt with ALS, you'll know that ALS robs a person of most of those qualities. It's very hard to be articulate. It's very, very hard to be classy. It's very, very difficult to read, and it's probably even more difficult to shop. But the one thing that ALS does not deprive you of, and it certainly didn't deprive my mother, is of her intelligence, her neshama. It really did not deprive her of her, or I should say she never allowed ALS to define who she was. And in that regard, my mother just had a burning desire, despite all of her limitations, to remain in her mind and in your mind the same person that we knew who she was 25 years ago. Go back probably to the Yom Tovim that we spent together. It was always ironic that my mother would sit slumped over in her wheelchair. She really couldn't support herself, and she really couldn't talk. And yet, during a meal, as soon as my father or any one of my kids would start saying over Dvar Torah, my mother would immediately pick herself up. She somehow or another found the strength. And then my mother would try to get just a sound out of her throat, and little by little, that sound would start to form words, and words would form ideas. And my mother would sit there and actually participate, not just participate, but give over what she heard from her father's home. And it was such an inspiring sight to behold, because a few minutes ago, she could barely lift her head, and then suddenly she found the energy. My mother never allowed us to walk into the house until she was fully dressed. She would always go through an entire procedure. She would be dressed in the morning. She would have her makeup on. And I never really understood, truth be told, I never understood why she went through all of these steps. What was the need? I used to say, Mommy, you know, we've seen each other in less formal circumstances. You really don't have to get dressed for me. You really don't have to go out of your way. You could be relaxed. But she insisted. And it was only really during the Shiva that I finally realized what the essence of my mother was and why she went to such an extent to maintain what I considered at the time almost a facade, almost a charade. And it's really based on a beautiful Sfas Emes that my daughter taught me a few years back. The Sfas Emes, in commenting on the pasuk, actually on Rashi's explanation of the pasuk about Shnei Chaye Sarah, Rashi says, Kulan Shavin Latova. They were equal in goodness. And the Sfas Emes explains beautifully, V'hu male gedola lios adam omed b'tmimuso v'chol masha over alav. That it's an incredible naila, it's an incredible accomplishment, an incredible feat for a person to be omed b'tmimuso, to remain firm in his convictions, to remain firm as a tamim, complete, whole, b'chol masha over alav, despite whatever transpired. Doesn't make a difference what happened, where they are, what they're experiencing. That person remains firm. Think about Sarah in this week's Parsha. She was first kidnapped by Paro. She was kidnapped by Avimelech. She didn't have children. She had to put up with Hagar. And yet Sarah never changed. Kol arucho sheba olam, says the Sfas Emes, ein zazen osomim komo. It didn't make a difference what happened. All the fiercest winds in the world couldn't budge that person, couldn't affect Sarah. The Amad B'tmimuso, and they stay firm, they're tamim. And that really was my mother. She didn't allow her personal circumstances to dictate who she was, which means she never saw herself as sick. She always wanted to remain that classy individual that I still have pictured in my head. She always wanted to be able to read and to convey and to exchange ideas. She never allowed her circumstances to affect her, that we would see her as an old sick lady and just ignore her while we all conversed. It's interesting that if you had to ask me one word to describe my mother, I would probably say that she was a holech. She was constantly on the move. My siblings would testify to the fact that my mother couldn't really move the last few years of her life. And yet, to this day, I see my mother as a holech. She constantly wanted to grow, constantly wanted to elevate herself. And it's ironic that not even death could deprive my mother of the ability, of the opportunity to teach us. To this day, I hear my mother in my ear. To this day, I constantly, especially when I try to improve myself, and especially when I try to struggle to overcome, it's my mother who's talking to me, telling me that I could do it, telling me that nothing's beyond my ability. And that's really what my mother represented. She constantly was teaching us by example at the end of her life that you have to keep on striving to move forward, keep on striving to learn. So what does this really have to do with any of us? I'll tell you that that's a lesson that I think each and every one of us, despite our circumstances, we're all bunkered down now with Corona. We're older, it's not easier, it's not easy. But my mother taught us to keep on trying to do better, keep on trying to learn. Just an example, just a few examples that come to mind. I was fortunate yesterday to make a siyum with my nephew, Rami. We now have finished 5 of the Siddharim and Mishnayos. We finished yesterday Seder Kutchin. Now, just for a little background, I have done this with Rami. We try to do it almost every night. We do it by telephone, given the distance. But Rami went to medical school. And while he was in medical school, and while he was an intern, while he was a fellow, and now, Baruch Hashem, he's an attending, we learned every single night. And we're zocha now to now move on to Seder Taharos. And in Yotz Hashem, within the next year or two, we'll be zocha to make a siyum, God willing, on Shisha Sidrei Mishnah. That was something that would make my mother proud, because that was something that she would do, always trying to elevate herself. And she always, by the way, whenever we made a siyum, no matter what her circumstances were, she joined us, made sure that she was there, and she would always add in with a word or two. It's interesting, just a few minutes ago, I was finishing a test that I take weekly on the Rashi on the week's Parsha. So there's a great little program. You could write it down if you're interested. It's called chumishrashitest.com. They pay you $100 for every Seder, for every Sefer that you're able to maintain an 80 average. What does that have to do with my mother? Because that's something that would inspire her. That's something that she would be proud of. That's something that she would do. The idea is, we all know Rashi. We all have learned it. We've all told it, all told over numerous Rashis at a Shabbos table. But do we really know Rashi? And my mother would love the fact that I have to sit there Shabbos and really struggle. My kids laugh because I'm literally studying for a test. I wake up Sunday morning before the crack of dawn because I want to take that test. I want to make sure that I do well, A, because I'll be embarrassed if my kids ask me what I received, but I want to get that $100. Not that it's going to make any great difference, but that was something that would define who my mother was. Never just sit back on your past accomplishments, never be complacent, use every opportunity to try to grow, to try to move further, to try to inspire yourself to keep pushing. And that's why, truth be told, my mother never stopped reading, despite the fact that she couldn't turn the pages on her own. My mother never stopped baking, despite the fact that she probably didn't step in the kitchen for years. My father would always bring over cakes that mommy baked. When did mommy bake it? Mommy would have it baked because that's who she was. That's what she wanted, that we always knew that she was thinking of us. And my mother would, as I said, she would always chime in, participate, always find a way to communicate. And she always found a way to shop, probably until the very end of her life. She never, ever, ever stopped. And when I think about all of these traits, I think about my mother. And like Rashi commented about Yitzchak when he brought Rivka into the tent, when he saw those very traits that defined who his mother was, he saw those traits within his wife, he had nechama. And he was inspired because he knew that he would now be able to convey, to relate, to pass on those very traits to the next generation. And that's when I see in myself, I see it in my children, I see it in my grandchildren, and I see it in my nieces, my nephews, their children. When I see my mother's great essence, that neshama, which ALS was never able to deprive her of, I'm inspired. It gives me nechama, but it gives me inspiration that we're going to pass that torch to the next generation. And that's why a Yom Iyun, Dad, is such a great and fitting tribute to Mommy, because even at the very end, the last few years of her life, she used to go into Yeshiva University for their Yom Iyun because she wanted to participate, she wanted to learn, she wanted to elevate, she wanted to educate herself. We should all be inspired by my mother's life. She never allowed the circumstances to define who she was, and we should never allow circumstances to define who we are. We should keep on pushing, growing as individuals. And that, if we could accomplish that, even just a little bit, we're going to bring a tremendous elevation to my mother's neshama, bring tremendous nachas ruach to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It'll bring the chama to our family, and it'll be a tremendous blessing for her memory.
Thank you, Joe. A big yasher koyach to you for that beautiful introduction to our presentation this morning, and for the Siyum Mishnayos that took place yesterday on Shabbos that you, together with my grandson, Dr. Rami Dennis, completed to coincide with with your mother's yahrzeit. Shkorach to you. Thank you again.
Amen.
At this time, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Mrs. Oralee Kanner. We had been privileged to study with Mrs. Kanner several years ago. As some of you may know, She is currently the principal of the Katz Yeshiva High School, where she has served as an administrator and teacher since its inception 19 years ago. Prior to being a principal, she had been the assistant principal of the Rabbi Alexander Gross Hebrew Academy, the school founded by her late father, who I was privileged to know. Orally Kana has been a guest lecturer in cities across the United States, Canada, and South Africa, and now it is really my great honor and pleasure to present to you Mrs. Ora Lee Kana.
Thank you so much. And thank you for allowing me to be part of this beautiful, beautiful yard site. Such a very special, special woman. I want to thank you, Joe, for giving me some knowledge of her. I knew her only vaguely through Hani, and what a special woman. In the merit of our learning together, may her neshama have an aliyah. We have been learning and we have been reading in the past few weeks the parshiot that deal with Avraham and Sarah. And I'd like to begin by citing two midrashim that are representative of an enigmatic train of thought that has always perplexed me. After the creation of the world, the Torah tells us, Eile toldot hashamayim v'haaretz bihi baram biyom asot Hashem eretz v'shamayim, meaning, this is the history of the heavens and the earth on the day that God created the earth and the heavens. The Baal HaTurim on this pasuk explains that this word bihi baram, a very strange word, is meant to be unscrambled and read be'avraham, as the letters are the same. And the pasuk's intention, says the Midrash, and says the Baal HaTurim in explaining this pasuk, is to teach that the world was created in the merit of Avraham. Bizchut Avraham nivra ha'olam. This is most certainly a very generous, turgid compliment for Avraham. But is this meant to be understood hyperbolically, or is this to be taken seriously, literally? The world was only created in the merit of Avraham? What does that mean? Furthermore, the Midrash contends and the Gemara brings down that the world was in a state of tohu for the first 2,000 years until Avraham appeared and brought organization and shed light on the turmoil and the darkness of the universe. Once again, how do we understand this rather arcane assertion? The Torah records that the earth was tohu vavohu on the first day of creation, after which the state of confusion and disarray was seemingly cleared. How then can Chazal come and assert that the world remained in that state until the advent of Abraham? Clearly, the resolution of these questions and of these difficult midrashim lies with a comprehension of the role of Abraham and his singular, unparalleled contribution to the world. In Parshat Chayei Sarah, the parsha that we just read, the Torah introduces Abraham's quest to find a girl for Yitzchak with the words, V'Hashem beirach et Avraham bakol. Hashem blessed Avraham with everything. What is everything? What is kol? What is this word all? The Even Ezra, for one, quotes a midrash that explains that bakol was actually the name of Abraham's daughter. Rashi, on the other hand, explains that the gematria of bakol is 52, which is the same numerical value, the gematria, as the word bain, which contextually is obviously far more logical. Avraham was blessed with a son, with Yitzchak, and that was everything to him. The pasuk is relating this now because since God blessed Avraham with a son, bakol, it behooved Avraham to now find a wife for him. The description, however, of his son as bakol is a rather abstruse characterization. We know how precious Yitzchak was to Avraham. Why is it necessary to tell us that he was bakol, that he was everything to Avraham? For a third explanation, the Ramban explains that one of the midot, one of the attributes of God, is a midah that is referred to as kol. This cognomen, this nickname of God, connotes that all, kol, is derived from him, as he is the center, the source, the origin of all. He is the creator and the sustainer of everything that exists. And everything, all, kol, must eventually be reunited, brought back, related back to its source, to God. By describing Abraham as being blessed with this characteristic, this quality of bakol, the Torah is in essence elucidating for us the greatness of Abraham, that he was able to then transmit to his son. Abraham understood that the purpose of man was to synthesize, to assimilate, to integrate, to unify all the particulars of the world by directing it all to its source, to God. Abraham saw all of existence as receptacles of godliness and intuited that man could infuse and must infuse the earth with spirituality. How did Abraham accomplish this divine feat, one that had heretofore eluded mankind? I believe the answer is to be found in the very first words uttered by God to Abraham. Lech lecha ma'artzecha. Go forth from your land, from your place of birth, from your father's home. Rashi, in a much quoted commentary, tells us, what is lech lecha, go for yourself? Says Rashi, lahana'atcha uletovatcha, for your pleasure and for your good. Now, these initially shocking words of Rashi seem to suggest that God is challenging Abraham to do what no man before him was able to successfully achieve, that being the service of God through the pleasurable utilization of this world, of the mundane. Thereby, through the usage of this world, the pleasurable, lahana atcha, usage of this world, thereby connecting all of existence to God. God's challenge to Abraham was to reap the benefits of life, to utilize power, wealth, honor, children, and land, but to utilize it properly in the service of God, and by so doing, you will connect it to its source. It will be imbued with kedusha. Through your pleasure in this world, Hashem will be served, as long as it is the appropriate pleasure that Hashem wants. Abraham is being told that he has the capacity to attain a level of ruchniut in gashmiut, that he must unite the heavens and earth. Abraham is commanded to infuse godliness into the material and elevate the physical to the spiritual. But how? Through the appropriate enjoyment of this world and by celebrating its connection to God. How did Abraham bring people to God? Not by insisting that they abdicate life, not that they renounce marriage and abjure wealth. Rather, Abraham set up Eshel. As Rashi and Chazal tell us, Eshel is an acronym for Achila, Shtiya, and Lina, wherein Abraham gave them Achila, food, and he edified them as to who was responsible for their savory food. He gave them drinks and reminded them to who gratitude must be paid for that which quenched their thirst. And after a good night's sleep, he taught them that it is God that restored their neshama to them upon rising. Abraham is blessed with that midah of kol, v'Hashem berachet Abraham bakol, that capacity to live, to appreciate the physical and unite all the particulars of this world to its source, to God. The significance of Abraham earning the accolade of chesed is to be found in his appreciation of that which he then freely and joyously gave others. And we emphasize this relationship of the appreciation of kol and the equality of generosity every day in our recitation in the Shemona Esrei, when we refer to God as Gomel Chasadim Tovim V'Koneh HaKol. I believe it is fair to assert that the meaning of our aforementioned medrash, that the world was in a state of tohu until Avraham, is merely underlying the message that the world was nothing more than material atoms, molecules, and shapes, even mature ones, formed and functioning in their respective postures. The tohu aspect that characterized these first 2,000 years prior to Abraham is that they were totally void of any spirituality. There was earth and its many physical entities, and then there were the heavens. Never the twain shall meet. Abraham was the first who was able to elevate the mundane to the heavenly, and the first to infuse the heavens spirituality into the physical, which was and continues to be the ultimate purpose of the Bria. It is no wonder that it is with Abraham that Hashem makes the covenant of Brit Milah. For it is Abraham who was the first to understand that even the body and its pleasures are kadosh and intended to be used to sanctify Shem Hashem. Rashi explains in that pasuk of Bihi Baram, that Behe Baram, that God created the universe with a He, because the bottom of that letter is open, allowing for the connection and relationship between the heavens and the earth. Perhaps this is the rationale between the He added to the name of Avram and Sarai. And Sarah was a partner in Abraham's theology. Her life exemplifies a life of kol, as evidenced by Chazal's extolling her for engendering Kedusha and instilling it into her home. Rashi, quoting the Midrash, claims that 3 marvels persisted while Sarah was alive. There was always a blessing in her challah, in her Isa. Her Shabbos candles illuminated her home throughout the week. And there was always a cloud of spirituality embracing her home. All 3 of these wonders, of these miracles, allude to her capacity to infuse the mundane, the physical, with Kedusha. Both Abraham and Sarah are credited with piercing the opaque veil that had heretofore separated the physical and the spiritual. The Navi Yeshayan joins us to look back at Avram and Sarah. Habitu el Avraham avichem ve'el Sarah ticholelchem. Remember your father Abraham and your foremother Sarah, who bored through, hollowed out from the root halal, allowing for passage between the heavens and the earth. Continues the pasuk, ki echad karativ. Hashem honors them with the accolade of one, as it is they who unified the universe into one. It is therefore literally in the merit of Avraham and Sarah that the earth was created. The genius of Avraham was in his understanding that it is not in the negation of the physical that brings one to holiness, but rather the proper utilization and enjoyment of the material that unites the sublime with the mundane. Avraham had 2 sons. Logic would dictate that the 2 would share in the legacy of Bakol, his great attribute, his lifelong vision, that which had been modeled and vigorously promoted by Avraham and Sarah, his father and mother, as the tachlit of all of creation, the purpose of creation, the design, the aim. However, the Torah relates that Yishmael had no tolerance for the notion of kol. In fact, he set out to destroy that ideal, the ideal of Sarah and Avraham. The Torah describes Yishmael as a para Adam, loosely defined as a wild man. Rav Moshe Shapiro discloses a Kabbalistic insight into the juxtaposition of the letters Pei and Resh in a shoresh, the root of a verb. He explains that whenever these letters, Pei and Resh, appear together in a word, they always denote separation, fragmentation, division, as in the words pared, to separate, paraz, to scatter, parach, to evaporate, etc. Clearly, Ishmael's aim as a pere Adam was to disenfranchise, to break the achdus, that of the ideal Adam. Adam, who was an amalgam of the physical, Adamah, and the spiritual, Adameh. Adam, who was that combination of a physical man that was endowed with a spiritual neshama, having been fashioned from the dust of the four corners of the earth, and within whom God blew nishmat chayim. The Torah tells us in describing Yishmael, Yado Bakol, his hand, the target of his life's venture was to destroy Kol. How aptly Rashi describes Yado Bakol as meaning Gezel, imputing Yishmael with thievery, for he uses the world that is God's without recognition or permission from its owner. Yishmael believed in God, in fact, in one God, but he viewed the physical world as void of God. One who cannot see spirituality in the physical is guilty of stealing when they partake of this world. Yishmael is no different from the reprobate Dor HaMabul, flagrantly culpable of theft. Noteworthy, in my opinion, is the fact that Yishmael was afforded the opportunity to pattern his life and shape his people in the paradigm of the Kol of his father, Avraham. It was Yishmael who, after Avraham, was the first to undergo the fulfillment of the covenant of Brit Milah, that which concretizes the very philosophy of Kol. A brit with God to circumscribe physical pleasure and elevate its pleasure beyond its animalistic tenor. It was Yishmael who first drank from the Be'er, the metaphysical well of water that was created Ben Hashmashot, that twilight time between the 6 days of the creation of the material world and the creation of the spiritual sanctity of Shabbos. It was that same well, according to Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer, from which Bnei Yisrael will drink in their trek through the desert hundreds of years later. The Be'er, as the man, were supernatural markers to reinforce the belief that everything physical, food, water, is connected to God. These opportunities were granted Yishmael, the son of Avraham, in hope that he would embrace the synthesis of both worlds. Yishmael, however, opted out of the worldview of Kol, Yado Bakol, refusing to accept a world where spirituality is infused within physicality. It was the perspicacious, intuitive wisdom of Sarah who recognized that Yishmael would not be part of the legacy of Kol. And perhaps that is the meaning of God's exhortation to Avraham, Kol asher tomar elecha Sarah, shma b'kolah. Heed Sarah's words regarding the safeguarding of Kol. I believe that the phenomenon of Yishmael's descendants can be seen today in the stalwart commitment of the Muslims to God, to prayer, to women's dress, far beyond what Judaism even demands. However, despite their undeniable, ardent emunah in God, in their God, their spirituality is totally distinct and isolated from all other facets of their lives. They lie, cheat, steal, rape, pillage, and savagely murder because godliness is compartmentalized. It has no place in the mundane, no say in the daily dealings of one's life. The world of Kol was inherited by Yitzchak. V'Hashem beirach et Avraham bakol. Indeed, that was embodied in his heir, Yitzchak. We perceive Yitzchak to be the most spiritual, the most lofty, the most ethereal of our avot, almost inscrutable and unfathomable. We are reminded that he could not exit Eretz Yisrael as his father before him and his son after him, due to the fact that he was an Olah Tmimah, he was a Karban Olah, having endured the most sublime experience of the Akedah. But we neglect perhaps to take note of the fact that no other personality in the Torah is attributed to having accumulated so much material wealth. In fact, Yitzchak is the only one of the Avot that owned land and was a farmer as well as a shepherd. The Torah describes Yitzchak's monetary success and material acquisitions in terms never seen before or after. It tells us in Perakav Vav, Vayigdal ha'ish, vayelech haloch v'gadel ad ki gadol me'od. Yitzchak owned land, cattle, wells, and yet was able to elevate it all, to imbue it all with godliness, with spirituality, to utilize it in the service of God, hence making it kadosh. It is Yitzchak, after all, who gives Meiser from his Mea Sha'arim, an act that brings sanctity to the entire field. Yes, he learned how to give Meiser from his father Avraham, who gave Meiser of what he had acquired to Melchizedek. As the Torah asserts, Vayikra lahem shemot, kishemot asher kara lahem aviv. Yitzchak was able to wield his wealth to disseminate the name of God through the naming of wells and places with God's attributes, as did his father Avraham. Yitzchak had no doubt that his sons Esav and Yaakov would share in the bakol that was the hallmark of the descendants of Avraham. It was the legacy of Avraham that he had inherited and he planned to pass to his children. It seemed clear, though, based on his sons' individual proclivities, that Yaakov, who demonstrated a natural penchant for the world of spirituality, Torah and Ruchniut, would be the master of the spiritual world, the Yoshev Ohalim, the one who would be isolated from the world, sitting and learning Torah. Esav, on the other hand, the crafty, adroit son, the natural red-blooded hunter, would control the physical world. Yitzchak had every belief that though divided, the philosophy of Kol would be preserved in the cooperative efforts of his two sons working in tandem. I believe that Yaakov and Esav were equally comfortable with this division of powers. The Torah relates in Parsha Toldot, in next week's Parsha, that Yaakov had been cooking lentil soup, as according to Rashi, on that day, Ba'oto Hayom, Avraham had died. While Yaakov was at home, mourning the death of his Zadi, of his grandfather, concurrently in the field, a dramatic historic event was unfolding. According to the Das Akanim, Ba'oto Hayom, on that very same day, Nimrod, the truculent, fearsome arch rival of Avraham, had encountered Esav hunting in the field. Nimrod insisted that Esav vacate the fields, claiming that he, Nimrod, was the king of the fields, and no one had the right to hunt on his land. Esav withdrew, returned home, dejected and depressed. He turned to his twin brother, according to the Datsikating Balei Tosfot, and he asks Yaakov for advice as to what he should do, how he could possibly defeat the fearsome warrior Nimrod. Yaakov listens and he imprises him that he, Esav, could overcome Nimrod as long as he gets Nimrod to divest himself of his jacket, of the bigdei chamudot, the coveted garments that Nimrod so proudly preened. These begadim, according to Chazal, were those that had been fashioned by God for Adam, following his eating from the Eitz Hadat, having chosen a life of physical pleasure. They were then bequeathed through Adam to Cain to Nimrod. These clothing symbolized the royal vestments of the master of the physical world, Adam, Cain, Nimrod, and now Esav. And so Esav returned to the fields and he challenged Nimrod to a duel, stipulating that Nimrod remove those bigdei chamudot. And when Nimrod takes off his jacket, Esav overpowers and kills Nimrod. Esav proudly takes the Bigdei Chamudot. He returns home wearing his trophy, famished and exhausted, and exclaims to Yaakov, Haliteni na min ha'adom hazeh. Translated as, pour down my throat, give me this red soup. The keen eye of Rav Yochanan Zweig picks up that this word Adom is actually written chaser. It is written without a vav, rendering the reading of the word not haliteni na min ha'adom hazeh, but haliteni na min ha'adam hazeh. I want a piece of, a part of Adam. I don't want the whole man. I want only his physical part, his Adamah. Essentially, Esav was demanding that which his uncle Yishmael had demanded, to be given only the part of Adam that is the material, the physical. Yaakov's response is therefore most fitting, as he demands in exchange the rights to the bracha of the Bechorah. The bracha of the Bechorah was the blessings of the spiritual world, which Yitzchak had always intended to give to Yaakov. Esav, the Torah reports, is more than willing to relinquish the spiritual. As he himself declares, Hinei anochi holech lamut, lama li ha-bechorah. The physical world, material, ages, deteriorates, and eventually perishes. There is no necessity for a spiritual world. What good are spiritual blessings? And so the division is procured amongst the brothers with mutual consent. Yitzchak is happy, his plan is intact. Esav is content with the physical world, and Yaakov is relieved to be getting the spiritual brachas. All is good in the house of Yitzchak and Rivka, except that Rivka, that sagacious mother of Esav and Yaakov, knew that any division of kol would be a declension, a regression, a nullification of its very essence. For a life of kol demands that each individual infuse godliness and ruchnius into their bodies, their homes, their relationships, and their livelihoods. This mission is that of each individual. It cannot be divided or fulfilled for you by another. She realizes that one son had to master both worlds, both the physical and the spiritual, for the Avrahamic philosophy, that which will be Torah, to survive. She therefore dresses Yaakov in those Bigdei Chamudot, signifying mastery of the physical world, and sends Yaakov into Yitzchak, dissembled as Esav, to receive the blessings of the material world, as well as the intended brachos that Yitzchak intended to give to him, the brachot of the spiritual world. The latter he receives from his father prior to departing from his home, thus securing for Klal Yisrael the entirety of kol. Yaakov, however, is unfortunately incapable of dealing with the material world. It is a realm in which he has little competency and no skill. After sequestering himself in the yeshiva of Shem and Ever, perhaps to fortify himself, to manage his newly obtained responsibilities, he sets out to his destination, to the house of Lavan. And the Torah relates that upon arriving at Luz, Yaakov falls into a deep sleep and he dreams an incredible vision of a ladder planted on the ground with its apex in the heavens. Yaakov sees angels ascending and descending the ladder, and upon awakening, Yaakov declares, Achein, yesh Elokim b'makom hazeh, va'anochi lo yadati. I would like to suggest that perhaps the epiphany that Yaakov has been aware of is the realization that the earth and heavens were indeed connected, that they're not two distinct separate worlds, and that his role, as is that of the angels, was to travel and traverse that ladder up and down, bringing godliness to earth and bringing the physical to the spiritual, to holiness. His declaration that there is God on earth is in fact, Ein ze ki im beit Elokim v'zeh sha'ar hashamayim, seems to underscore his acknowledgement that this very earth is the abode of God, as everything is God's. And most telling is his recognition that the gates to heaven are not in the Shamayim, but rather through life on earth. En zeh ki im bet Elokim v'zeh sha'ar hashamayim. Yaakov meekly asks God for lechem le'echol v'beged lilbash, assistance in finding his footing in the physical world, and in return he vows to live the life of his father and grandfather by giving ma'aser, sanctifying his earthly gains and building a monument to promulgate God in this world. We see the metamorphosis of Yaakov upon his return from years of suffering in the difficult world of his mendacious father-in-law, Lavan. He reappears to greet his nemesis Esav with the famous exchange between them, where Esav informs Yaakov that Yesh li Rav, I have an abundance, and Yaakov responds, Yesh li kol, I have finally mastered kol. In light of the shir, I would like to suggest that Yaakov is averring that after all these years, I have achieved the level of Yitzchak and Abraham in the ability to fuse the mundane with the spiritual. The Torah records that immediately after this encounter, Esav returned to his land of Seir, and Yaakov travels to Sukkot. And we know that the Torah tells us that Yavo Yaakov Shalem Ir Shechem. He comes Shalem, complete, whole, integrated. As Rashi expounds, Shalem Bigufo, Shalem Bimamono, Shalem Bitorato, complete in the realm of the material, the physical, and the spiritual. According to Rashi, it was Yaakov who minted coins and even built shopping malls, surely a reflection of the shlemut that he had finally attained. In conclusion, after eating, satiating ourselves, enjoying the produce of the earth, we are commanded to pay tribute and show our appreciation to God. V'achalta v'savata uveirachta. And in benching we say, Kemo shenitbarchu avotenu, Avraham, Yitzchak, v'Yaakov, bakol mikol kol, ken yivarech otanu, kulanu yachad, bivracha shlema. We ask Hashem to bless us with the brachot of our forefathers, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, the bracha of the bakol of Avraham, the mikol of Yitzchak, and the yesh li kol of Yaakov. May we all be zoche, may we merit the bracha shlema, allowing for the infusion in our lives of spirituality in all areas of our lives. Thank you so much. It was a privilege to be learning this morning with you.
Thank you, Mrs. Kanda, for the wonderful opportunity to learn from you and with you this morning. We will look forward to a replica of similar session in the near future, Mitzvah. Thanks to all of you who attended, who joined us this morning. In Yitzhak Hashem, the Neshama should have an aliyah, and I'm sure she does at this point with all that we've spoken. And we should see each other again in Yitzhak Hashem most simplest. Shkolach to everyone. Thank you.